Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, we're talking gas forges. So I get a lot of questions about forge design, forge configuration, making forges. So today I'm going to talk about all of the above. The anatomy of forges, burner types, size, shape, all that sort of thing. But once we get through the details though, I'll talk about what I think are good forge designs for particular uses and things that you might want to try if you're interested in making one. So first, if you're new to this, 99% of modern knife makers, at least in Western countries, use propane gas forges. They're clean, there's no smoke, there's no smell, there are no sparks flying out to set your shop on fire. They get plenty hot to forge weld, they're pretty easy to control, they're pretty simple to operate, they're not too expensive, there's readily available fuel, really just a laydown. They're the most complete solution to a forge for most modern makers. Not in all ways, there's some advantages to charcoal and to coal, but for most knife makers, they're the best solution. Before I go any further, I want to tell you, they're really not that hard to make. It's not something you need to be too intimidated about. When I made mine, it was really early in my knife making career. I was pretty nervous about it, to be honest with you. I was afraid I was going to blow something up, burn up my shop, whatever. And provided you take reasonable safety precautions, there shouldn't be any concern about that. I made my forge, which still works fine, when I had no tools and completely had no idea what I was doing. If you're hesitating about making a forge, don't worry, it's not that hard. Second point, a single tank of propane can blow up your entire neighborhood. Be very, very careful about how you store and use your gas. If you situate your forge intelligently, you'll never set anything on fire. That's really not the big danger. But if you have a tank leaking gas into an enclosed space, really bad things can happen. Forges also produce carbon monoxide. As Doug Markaitis says, it will kill. Now look, this doesn't mean you need to be paranoid. It just means you should only use gas forges in extremely well ventilated spaces. Okay, safety lesson over. So, what does a gas forge consist of? Generally, there's a metal shell that keeps the whole thing from falling apart. There's a burner or several burners that provide heat. You'll also need a regulator. And there's some kind of insulation. That's really about it. You crank it up, flame shoots out of the burner, it gets hot. It's just no more complicated than that. So, let's start with the overall shape. First, this isn't life or death important. There are box-shaped forges, vertical tubes, horizontal tubes. There's a logic to these things, and they all have some advantages and disadvantages, but that's not to say that it's really crazy important which size or shape you choose. Now, if you do swords, long cylinders are nice. If you do a lot of Damascus, you want to design with an easily replaceable floor because flux will eat it up pretty quickly. And you want it big enough to handle whatever type of knife you typically make. Obviously, you want it to get hot enough to do whatever you need to do, and you want it to operate reasonably efficiently. So a lot of what drives the actual shape of the forge is driven by whatever little piece of crap metal that you've harvested to make the shell from. Old propane tanks, really popular. If you can weld, making a box shape is relatively simple, so that's pretty popular too. If I were using a propane cylinder, I'd probably go vertical rather than horizontal because you can put fire brick in the bottom and then replace it fairly easily when it gets eaten up by flux, which will happen if you do a lot of forge welding. Horizontal cylinders, you basically have to totally reline. You need ports on both sides of the forge so that you can stick blades all the way through. If those ports are too small, they'll choke off your burners and shoot flames way out of the forge. If you have no way of tightening up the ports of your forge, it won't be super efficient and will cost more money to operate. Hey guys, let me butt in here real quick to mention that if you're enjoying my videos, I hope you'll help out my channel by supporting us on Patreon. It's easy to do. Just click the link in the cards or go to this address down here and have at it. It's hard to believe, but I've actually been making these videos for a decade now. I've got almost 300 videos available on the channel. So looking back over that span of time, I've probably taken, 2 or 3 years of work time away from the time that I spend, putting food on the table for my family, so that you guys can avoid wasting time making the kind of mistakes I've made. So I hope you'll help out. And in addition to that, you'll also have access to plans for many of the projects. If you support the channel on Patreon, it's all there. You can go just click on them and download all kinds of different plans, all the dimensions and where the holes are and all kinds of things that'll help you move a little faster into those projects. All right, back to work. There's no magic formula here. If you have a space that's 4 to 6 inches square by 12 inches or so, you'll be able to make nearly any kind of knife imaginable, even knives a good bit longer than 12 inches. When you're forging, you don't need to heat up the entire knife. You're just heating up section by section the chunks that you're forging. You want enough internal volume so that you're not sticking your blades right into the bright blue cone of the flame. There are basically two parts to the flame, and that little inner cone, the brighter part, which typically extends a couple inches out of the burner, that's a very oxidizing environment, and you want to avoid it because it causes scaling and decarburization in your blade. When you're thinking about a forge, just make sure you properly account for how thick your insulation is. If you start with a 10-inch diameter shell, 2 layers of ends wool or KO wool or whatever will knock you down to about 5 inches in diameter. Speaking of insulation, there are 3 main types of insulation. First, insulating fibers like ends wool or KO wool. It's like the pink stuff in your house, only made from higher temperature materials. Second, fire brick. And third, castable refractories. Now, insulating fiber is light, it's versatile, it insulates really well, and it doesn't suck up a lot of heat, so you can bring the forge to heat really quickly. Typically, it comes in 1-inch thickness, and I personally use 2 layers of it. The cons are that it's really fragile, it gets eaten up by flux just almost instantaneously, and there's no doubt that it's not really good to inhale. Fire brick comes in a couple different grades. Really soft stuff, harder stuff. The soft stuff is the best insulator, so that's what you want to use for forge construction. That's my recommendation anyway. Now, the con or the disadvantage of the soft fire brick or fire brick in general is that it crumbles, it cracks pretty easily, and it doesn't come up to temperature quite as fast as the wool types of insulation. So castable refractories are basically analogous to Portland cement, concrete, whatever, but adapted for high temperatures, so there are different materials involved. You basically just mix them up, pour them into a mold, they set, and then you've got a fairly permanent refractory insulator. The downside is they absorb way more heat than the other alternatives, so they're slower to temp and less efficient, but they do hold up pretty well. So, what's the logic of any of these? Fiber is ideal for cylindrical forges because you can mold it to the shape of the forge. You'll also see it in pretty much every shape of forge, but it's perfect for that. Brick is ideal for box-type forges and forged bottoms. You can find it in thin slabs and big, thick bricks. Being able to remove or at least smash out the bottom of your forge without disturbing the walls is really nice when you got lots of flux in the bottom. Castable? Whole bunch of different kinds, bubble, alumina, satinite, various other things. Well, personally, I wouldn't use it to make an entire forge because of the inefficiency point, but if you just want to make some random shape, I guess, hey, go for it. That said, I personally use it to line the bottom of my horizontal cylinder forge because it holds up much better than the alternatives, and fitting a solid brick in the bottom is kind of tricky to do. All right, let's turn to burners. There are 2 basic types, Venturi and forced air. Forced air is simple to operate and easy to tune, and you can really blast it. Basically, you're just blowing air through a pipe using a fan. You've got a little gas port that shoots gas into the pipe, it mixes on the way out, and it burns when it comes out the far end. Venturis use the Venturi principle to harness the energy of compressed air gas shooting out of a little jet or port to create an air draft in the burner. You can buy them or you can make them. The advantage of Venturi burners are simplicity, no need for electricity, and relative quiet and safety. I'll get into the safety point in a moment. The advantages of forced air are that you can really tune them easily, make your flame richer or leaner, and they blast out a lot of heat. The disadvantages are that the fan makes them much louder than Venturis, and you need electricity to run them. So if the electricity goes out, your forge is dead. Now that in itself is an annoyance, but it also has a safety implication. If you walk away from a forced air forge and the power goes out, the air goes away, but the gas continues to bleed into the system, which can potentially cause explosions and other safety problems. Okay, so let's say you want to make one. Is it hard? Not really. I made my forge with the most ridiculously primitive tools. It looks like ass and it's not super efficient, but it works fine. I made these Venturis out of plumbing pipe and old map gas bottles. Again, totally crap looking things, but they work fine. I can easily reach welding heat, roughly 2400 degrees in this forge, and that's all you need. You'll also need a regulator, which is basically just a valve that allows you to control how much gas goes into your forge. The ideal one is a propane specific 2-gauge regulator that shows both the inlet and outlet pressure. But you can also use single gauge or no gauge ones, and you can also get by using acetylene regulators, but propane's ideal. Alright, so let me walk you through the decision tree of what you might want to do. Now, one general point, there's no perfect forge. Basically, there are 3 things that you might want to do with a forge. The first is forging itself, the second is forge welding, and then the third is heat treating. And no forge is going to do those equally well, especially heat treating. If you really want a specialized heat treating forge, it's just going to be quite different in construction from what you would do to do forging and forge welding. So for most of us, the question is, what compromise are we willing to get us closest to the things that we really want to do? So the first question that you need to ask yourself is, what are you planning to use it for? Provided that you don't want to make big swords, I wouldn't make it much longer than 12 inches. Now, if you plan to make Damascus, and trust me, if you get a forge, eventually you're going to try to make Damascus, you want a forge that obviously has a big enough bore that you can get the billet into it comfortably. So personally, I wouldn't want to go much smaller than 4 inches square internally. Mine's a little bit bigger than that so that I can comfortably get Damascus billets in before they get all squashed together. So the next thing is, what kind of shell do you want? If you can weld, then you can make a square forged shell any size you want and basically make your own version of the commercial box type forges like the NC Tool Knife Maker series. Or you can do it all with big fire brick, which will take up more space but should run nice and hot. If you can't weld or don't have access to a welder, it's just a question of laying your hands on the right hunk of metal. Old propane tanks are very popular. Also hot water heater cores, big iron pipes, whatever. In whatever case, you're talking about a cylinder. Now, if you want to make swords, I'd recommend making a long horizontal like mine. Mine's about 24 inches long. But look, if you're not a sword guy, I personally would make a vertical with 2 layers of wool refractory walls and ceiling, and then a brick or castable bottom. That way you can bust it out and replace the floor. Cut 2 ports with an angle grinder, and you've got a terrific and relatively efficient forge. The final piece of the pie is the heat source. Now this is really a personal choice. I went for Venturis because of safety and quietness. They're still noisy enough that it's tough to listen to the radio around them, so don't think they're going to make no noise at all, but your neighbors are not going to notice them. So for me, safety was the deciding factor. Now there's a solution for the safety issue with forced air. You just need an inline cutoff valve on the gas line, which is linked to your electricity. Electricity goes out, the gas switches off automatically, problem solved. Commercial forges are almost always sold with these, but if you're doing it yourself, it's more work, it's more expense, and you got to spend time figuring out what this electricity stuff is. Now, as far as burner location goes, I prefer them to come from the side and swirl onto the other wall of the forge so they're not blasting directly onto the knife, unless you want them to. But many of the commercial forges blast straight down into the forge and they seem to work just fine. So, yeah, there you go. Now, a few last odds and ends. A handy thing is to have a door. That way you can have a small hatch in the door that you can stick small skinny items like knives through. This keeps the forge efficient, but if you want to put something bigger in, then you can open the door. Make sure you insulate the door with fire brick or insulating wool. Now, I had a Patreon subscriber recently ask me about putting a thermocouple in the forge to measure the temperature. You know, it's not a bad idea, but personally I don't see a big need for it because there's generally a fair amount of variation between the temperatures in different parts of the forge. Now, of course, depending on the forge design, some of them are going to be more even than others. And I'm not saying that it's not nice to have a general sense of what's going on. Just bear in mind that if you put a probe over in one corner, it's going to be potentially several hundred degrees cooler than it is where the flame is actually coming out. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a decent sense of the variables that are involved in making forges. Now, like I say, don't feel like you can't make one if you don't have lots of, fancy metalworking equipment or whatever. I mean, you wouldn't believe how primitive the equipment was that I used when I first made my forge. I've still got that forge. It still works great. So you can get there. Now, the other important thing is you want to be smart. You want to be careful, be safe, be sure you have good ventilation, and be sure that you store the propane safely. All right, so that about wraps it up. Now, I'm planning to reline my forge with new insulation in the not too distant future. The whole insulation piece of the pie is really, about 50% of forge making. So if you are interested in making a forge for yourself, check out that video and that'll have some good information for you. Thanks for watching, guys. If you feel like you got something out of this video, don't forget to subscribe. Also, click on the link to Patreon for a great way to give back to the channel. Plus, check me out on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Links in the description. If you want something sharp and pointy, maybe a gift for yourself or one of the cooler people in your life, check out my Tactics Armory website and pick up one of our tactical or outdoor knives. And finally, if you want to learn to make hamones or Japanese swords, check out WalterSorrellsBlades.com, where you can find videos about how I make hamones, as well as forging, mounting, polishing, and fittings for Japanese swords. Thanks, and see you soon.